The Orange Yellow Diamond by J.S. Fletcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 34. Baffled. Lavendale paused at this point of his story, and looked round the circle of attentive faces. He was quick to notice that two men were watching him with particularly close attention. One was Ayscough, the other, the old solicitor. And as he resumed his account he glanced meaningly at Mr. Killick.
I dare say some of you would like to question me, and Stephen Purvis too, on what I have already told you,
he said.
You're welcome to ask any questions you like, any of you, when I've done. But let me finish, for then perhaps you'll fully understand what we were at. Purvis and I walked up and down in Oxford and Cambridge Terrace for some time, discussing the situation. The more I considered the matter, the more I was certain that my first theory was right. The Chinaman had got the diamond and the banknotes. I was aware of these two Chinamen as tenants of Martinius's furnished house. As a matter of fact, I had been present at the shop in Pratt Street on one of my 2 visits there when they concluded their arrangements with him. What I now thought was this: one of them had called on the old man to do some business or to pay the rent, and had found him in a fit, or dead, as the result of one, had seen the diamond and the money on the table, placed there in readiness for Purvis's coming, and had possessed himself of both and made off. Purvis agreed with me, and both Purvis and myself are well acquainted with the characteristic peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of Chinamen. We knew with what we had to deal. Therefore we knew what we had to do. We wanted the diamond and my money. And since we were uncomfortably aware of the craft and subtlety of the thief who had got both, we knew we should have to use craft ourselves, and of no common sort. Therefore we decided that the very last thing we should think of would be an immediate appeal to the police. Now, you police officials may, nay, will, say that we ought to have gone straight to you, especially as this was a case of murder. But we knew nothing about it being a case of murder. We had seen no signs of violence on the old man. I knew him to be very feeble, and I believed he had been suddenly struck over by paralysis or something of that sort. I reckoned matters up carefully. It was plain that Daniel Martinius had been left alone in house and shop, that his granddaughter was out on some errand or other. Therefore no one knew of the diamond and the money. We did not want anyone to know. If we had gone to the police and told our tale, the news would have spread and would certainly have reached the Chinaman's ears. We knew well enough that if we were to get our property back, the thief must not be alarmed. There must be nothing in the newspapers next morning. The Chinaman must not know that the real owners of the diamond and the banknotes suspected him. He must not know that the information about his booty was likely to be given to the police. He must be left to believe, for some hours at any rate, that what he had possessed himself of was the property of a dead man who could not tell anything. But there was my book in that dead man's parlour. It was impossible to go back and fetch it. It was equally impossible that it should not attract attention. Daniel Martinius's granddaughter, whom I believed to be a very sharp young woman, would notice it and would know that it had come into the place during her absence. I thought hard over that problem, and finally I drafted an advertisement and sent it off to an agency with instructions to insert it in every morning newspaper in London next day. Why? Because I wanted to draw a red herring across the trail. I wanted, for the time being, to set up a theory that some man or other had found that book in the omnibus, had called in at Martinius's to sell or pawn it, had found the old man alone and had assaulted and robbed him. All this was with a view to hoodwinking the Chinaman. Anything must be done, anything, to keep him ignorant that Purvis and I knew the real truth. But what did we intend to do? I tell you, not being aware that old Daniel Martinez had met his death by violence, we did not give 1 second's thought to that aspect and side of the affair. We concentrated on the recovery of our property. I knew the house in which these Chinese lived. That evening Purvis and I went there. We have both been accustomed in our time to various secret dealings and manoeuvres, and we entered the grounds of that house without anyone being the wiser. It did not take long to convince us that the house was empty. It remained empty that night. Purvis kept guard over it in an outhouse in the garden. No one either entered or left it between our going to it and Purvis coming away from it next morning. He stayed there watching until it was time to keep an appointment with me in Hyde Park. Before I met him I had been called upon by Detective Ayscough, Mr. Rubinstein and Mr. Lauriston. They know what I said to them. I could not at that time say anything else. I had my own concerns to think of. When Purvis and I met, we had another consultation, and we determined, in view of all the revelations which had come out and had been published in the papers, that the suspicion cast on young Mr. Lauriston was the very best thing that could happen for us. It would reassure our Chinaman. And we made up our minds that the house in Maida Vale would not be found untenanted that night, and we arranged to meet there at 11 o'clock. We felt so sure that our man would have read all the news in the papers and would feel safe, and that we should find him. But, mark you, we had no idea as to which of the two Chinamen it was that we wanted. Of one fact, however, we were certain. Whichever it was that I had seen slip round the corner of Iron Gate Wharf the previous day, whether it was Chang Li or Chang Li, he would have kept his secret to himself. The thing was to get into that house, to get into a conversation with both, to decide which was the guilty man, and then to take our own course. We knew what to do, and we went fully prepared. Now we come to this, our second visit to the house in Maida Vale. To be exact, it was between 11 and 12 on the second night after the disappearance of the diamond. As on the previous night, we gained access to the garden by the door at the back. That, on each occasion, was unfastened, while the gate giving access to the road in Maida Vale was securely locked. And as on the previous night, we quickly found that, up to then at any rate, the house was empty. But not so the garden. While I was looking round the further side of the house, Purvis took a careful look round the garden, and presently he came to me and drew away to the asphalted path which runs from the front gate to the front door. The moon had risen above the houses and trees, and in its light he pointed to blood-stains. It did not take a second look, gentlemen, to see that they were recent, in fact, fresh. Somebody had been murdered in that garden not many minutes, literally minutes, before our arrival. And within 2 minutes more we found the murdered man lying behind some shrubbery on the left of the path. I knew him for the younger of the two Chinese, the man called Chang Li. This discovery, of course, made us aware that we were now face to face with a new development. We were not long in arriving at a conclusion about that. Chang Li had found out that his friend had become possessed of these valuables. He might have discovered a matter of the diamond or of the banknotes or both, how was immaterial. But we were convinced, putting everything together, that he had made this discovery, had probably laid in wait for Chang Li as he returned home that night, had run a knife into him as he went up the garden, had dragged the body into the shrubbery, possessed himself of the loot and made off. And now we were face to face with what was going, as we knew, to be the stiffest part of our work, the finding of Chang Li. We set to work on that without a moment's delay. I have told you that Purvis and I have a pretty accurate knowledge of Chinamen. We have both had deep and intimate experiences of them and their ways. I personally know a good deal of the Chinese colony in London. I have done business with Chinamen both in London and South Africa for years. I had a good idea of what Chang Li's procedure would be. He would hide, if need be, for months, until the first heat of the hue and cry, which he knew would be sure to be raised, would have cooled down. There are several underground warrens, so to speak, in the East End, in which he could go to earth, comfortably and safely, until there was a chance of slipping out of the country unobserved. I know already of some of them. I would get to know of others. Purvis and I got on that track, such as it was, at once. We went along to the East End there and then. Before morning I had shaved off my beard and moustache, disguised myself in old clothes, and was beginning my work. First thing next morning I did two things. One was to cause a telegram to be sent from Spring Street to my butler explaining my probable absence. The other to secretly warn the Bank of England about the banknotes. But I had no expectation that Chang Li would try to negotiate those. All his energies, I knew, would be concentrated on the diamond. Nevertheless, he might try, and would, if he tried, succeed in changing one note, and it was as well to take that precaution. Now then, next day, Purvis and I being, in our different ways, at work in the East End, we heard the news about the Pratt Street tradesman, Parslett. That seemed to me remarkable proof of my theory. As the successive editions of the newspapers came out during that day and next day, we learned all about the Parslett affair. I saw through it at once. Parslett, being next-door neighbour to Daniel Martinez, had probably seen Chang Li, whom we now believe to have been the actual thief, slip away from Martinez's door, and, when the news of Daniel's death came out, had put two and two together, and, knowing where the Chinaman lived, had gone to the house in Maida Vale to blackmail them. I guessed what had happened then. Parslett, to quieten him for the moment, had been put off with £50 in gold, and promised more, and he had also been skilfully poisoned in such a fashion that he would get safely away from the premises, but die before he got home. And when he was safe away, Chang Li had murdered Chang Li and made off. So, as I still think, all our theories were correct, and the only thing to do was to find Chang.
But here Levendale paused, glanced at Stephen Purvis, and spread out his hands with a gesture which indicated failure and disappointment. His glance moved from Stephen Purvis to the police officials.
"All no good,"
he exclaimed.
"It's useless to deny it. I have been in every Chinese den and haunt in East London. I'm certain that Chang Li is nowhere down there. I have spent money like water, employed Chinese and Easterns on whom I could depend. There isn't a trace of him. And so we gave up last night. Purvis and I, baffled. We've come to you police people."
"You should have done that before, Mr. Levendale,"
said the inspector severely.
"You haven't given us much credit, I think, and if you had told all this at first—"
Before the inspector could say more, a constable tapped at the door and put his head into the room. His eyes sought Ayscough.
"There's a young gentleman, foreigner, asking for you, Mr. Ayscough,"
he said.
"Wants to see you at once. Name of Mr. Yada."
End of chapter 34. The Orange Yellow Diamond by J.S. Fletcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 35. Yada Takes Charge. Ayscough had only time to give a warning look and a word to the others before Mr. Mori Yada was ushered in. Every eye was turned on him as he entered, some of the men present looking at him with wonder, some with curiosity, two, at any rate, Levendale and Stephen Purvis, with doubt. But Yada himself was to all outward appearance utterly indifferent to the glances thrown in his direction. It seemed to John Purdy, who was remembering all he had heard the night before, that the young Japanese medical student was a singularly cool and self-possessed hand. Yada, indeed, might have been walking in on an assemblage of personal friends, specially gathered together in his honor. Malky Rubinstein, who was also watching him closely, noticed at once that he had evidently made a very careful toilet that morning. Yada's dark overcoat, thrown negligently open, revealed a smart gray lounge suit. In one gloved hand he carried a new bowler hat, in the other a carefully rolled umbrella. He looked as prosperous and as severely in mode as if no mysteries and underground affairs had power to touch him, and the ready smile with which he greeted Ayscough was ingenuous and candid enough to disarm the most suspicious.
"Good morning, Mr. Detective,"
he began, as he crossed the threshold and looked first at Ayscough and then at the ring of attentive faces.
"I want to speak to you on that little affair of last night, you know. I suppose you are discussing it with these gentlemen. Well, perhaps I can give you some information that will be useful."
"Glad to hear anything, Mr. Yada,"
said Ayscough, who was striving hard to conceal his surprise.
"You've heard something during the night, then?"
Yada laughed pleasantly, showing his white teeth. He dropped into the chair which Ayscough pushed forward, and slowly drew off his gloves.
"I assured myself of something last night after you left,"
he said, with a knowing look.
"I used your card to advantage, Mr. Detective. I went to the mortuary."
Ayscough contrived to signal to the inspector to leave the talking to him. He put his thumbs in the armholes of his waistcoat, assumed an easy attitude as he leaned against the door, and looked speculatively at the newcomer.
"Aye, and what made you do that now, Mr. Yada?"
he asked, half carelessly.
"A bit of curiosity, eh?"
"No idle curiosity, Mr. Detective,"
replied Yada.
"I wanted to know, to make certain, which of the two Chinamen it really was who was there, dead. I saw him. Now I know. Chang Li."
"Well?"
said Ayscough. Yada suddenly twisted round in his chair, and slowly glanced at the listening men on either side of the desk. They were cool, bold, half-insolent eyes which received face after face, showing no recognition of any until they encountered Malky Rubinstein's watchful countenance, and to Malky Yada accorded a slight nod, and turned to Ayscough again.
"Which,"
he asked calmly,
"which of these gentlemen is the owner of the diamond? Which is the one who has lost £80,000 in banknotes? That is what I want to know before I say more."
In the silence which followed upon Ayscough's obvious doubt about answering this direct question, Levendale let out a sharp, half-irritable exclamation.
"In God's name,"
he said,
"who is this young man? What does he know about the diamond and the money?"
Yada turned and faced his questioner, and suddenly smiling, thrust his hand in his breast pocket and drew out a card case. With a polite bow he handed a card in Levendale's direction.
"Permit me, sir,"
he said suavely.
"My card. As for the rest, perhaps Mr. Detective here will tell you."
"It's this way, you see, Mr. Levendale,"
remarked Ayscough.
"Acting on information received from Dr. Pitteri, one of the junior house surgeons at University College Hospital, who told me that Mr. Yada was a fellow student of those two Chinese, and a bit of a friend of theirs. I called on Mr. Yada last night to make inquiries, and of course I had to tell him about the missing property. Though, to be sure, that's news that's common to everybody now, through the papers. And what else have you to tell, Mr. Yada?"
But Yada was watching Levendale, who, on his part, was just as narrowly watching Yada. The other men in the room watched these two, recognizing, as if by instinct, that from that moment matters lay between Levendale and Yada and not between Yada and Ayscough. They were mutually inspecting and appraising each other, and in spite of their impassive faces, it was plain that each was wondering about his next move. It was Levendale who spoke first. Spoke as if he and the young Japanese were the only people in the room, as if nothing else mattered. He bent forward to Yada.
How much do you know?
He demanded. Yada showed his white teeth again.
A plain and a wide question, Mr. Levendale,
he answered with a laugh.
I see that you are anxious to enlist my services. Evidently you believe that I know something, but you are not the owner of the diamond. Which of these gentlemen is?
Levendale made a half-impatient gesture towards Stephen Purvis, who nodded at Yada but remained silent.
He is,
said Levendale testily.
But you can do your talking to me. Again, how much do you know in this matter?
Enough to make it worth your while to negotiate with me,
answered Yada.
Is that as plain as your question?
It's what I expected,
said Levendale.
You want to sell your knowledge.
Well,
assented Yada.
I am very sure you are willing to purchase.
Once more that duel of the eyes, and to John Purdy, who prided himself on being a judge of expressions, it was evident that the younger man was more than the equal of the older. It was Levendale who gave way, and when he took his eyes off Yada, it was to turn to Stephen Purvis. Stephen Purvis nodded his head once more, and growled a little.
Make terms with him,
he muttered.
Case of have to, I reckon.
Levendale turned once more to the Japanese, who smiled on him.
Look you here, Mr. Yada,
said Levendale.
I don't know who you are beyond what I'm told. Your card tells me nothing except that you lodge, I suppose, in Gower Street. You got mixed up in this somehow, and you got knowledge to dispose of. Now, I don't buy unless I know first what it is I'm buying. So, let's know what you've got to sell.
Yada swept the room with a glance.
Before these gentlemen?
He asked.
In open market, eh?
They're all either police or detectives or concerned,
retorted Levendale.
There's no secret. I repeat, what have you got to sell? Specify it.
Yada lifted his hands and began to check off points on the tips of his fingers.
3 items then, Mr. Levendale,
he replied cheerfully.
First, the knowledge of who got the diamond and the money. Second, the knowledge of where he is at the moment, and where will be for some hours. Third, the knowledge of how you can successfully take him and recover your property. 3 good, saleable items, I think, yes?
Purdy watched carefully for some sign of greed or avarice in the informer's wily countenance. To his surprise, he saw none. Instead, Yada assumed an almost sanctimonious air. He seemed to consider matters, though his answer was speedy.
I don't want to profit unduly by this affair,
he said.
At the same time, for all I've heard, I'm rendering you and your friend a very important service, and I think it only fair that I should be remunerated. Give me something towards the expenses of my medical education, Mr. Levendale. Give me £500.
With the briefest exchange of glances with Stephen Purvis, Levendale pulled out a cheque-book, dashed off a cash cheque, and handed it over to the Japanese, who slipped it into his waistcoat pocket.
Now, your information,
said Levendale.
To be sure,
replied Yada.
Very well. Chang Li has the diamond and the money, and he is at this moment where he has been for some days, in hiding. He is in a secret room at the place called Pilmansey's Tea Rooms, in Tottenham Court Road, a place much frequented by medical students from our college. The fact of the case is, Mr. Policeman, and the rest of you generally, there is a secret opium den at Pilmansey, though nobody knows of it but a few frequenters, and there you will find Chang Li.
You've seen him there?
demanded Levendale.
I saw him there during last night. I know him to be there. He will be there either until you take him, or until his arrangements are made for getting out of this country,
answered Yada. Levendale jumped up, as if for instant action, but the inspector quietly tapped him on the elbow.
He promised to tell you how to take him, Mr. Levendale,
he said.
Let's know all we can. We shall have to be in with you on this, you know.
Mr. Police Inspector is right,
said Yada.
You have to conduct what you call a raid. Now do precisely what I tell you to do. Pilmansey is an old-fashioned place, a very old house as regards its architecture, on the right-hand side of Tottenham Court Road. Go there today. 'Tis midday, a little before 1, when there are always plenty of customers. Go with plenty of your plain-clothes men, like Mr. Ayscough there. Drop in, don't you see, as if you were customers. Let there be plenty of you, I repeat. There are 2 Pilmansey men, middle-aged, sly, smooth, crafty men. When you are all there, take your own lines. Close the place, the doors, if you like, but get hold of the Pilmansey men. Tell them you are police. Insist on being taken to the top floor and shown their opium den. They will object, they will lie, they will resist. You will use your own methods, but in that opium den you will find Chang Li and your property.
He had been drawing on his gloves as he spoke, and now, picking up his hat and umbrella, Yada bowed politely to the circle and moved to the door.
You'll excuse me now,
he said.
I have an important lecture at the medical school which I must not miss. I shall be at Pilmansey myself a little before 1. Please oblige me by not taking any notice of me. I do not want to figure actively in your business.
Then he was gone, and the rest of them were so deeply taken with the news which he had communicated that no one noticed that just before Yada fastened his last glove button, Melky Rubenstein slipped from his corner and glided quietly out of the room. End of chapter 35. The Orange Yellow Diamond by J.S. Fletcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 36. Pilmansey's Tea Rooms. 2 hours later, it being then 1:45, Purdy and Lauriston got out of a taxicab at the north end of Tottenham Court Road and walked down the right-hand side of that busy thoroughfare, keeping apparently careless but really vigilant eyes open for a first glimpse of the appointed rendezvous. But Pilmansey's tea rooms required little searching out. In the midst of the big modern warehouses, chiefly given up to furniture and upholstery, there stood at that time a block of old property which was ancient even for London. The buildings were plainly early 18th century, old red brick erections with narrow windows in the fronts and dormer windows in the high, sloping roofs. Some of them were already doomed to immediate dismantlement. The tenants had cleared out. There were hoardings raised to protect passers-by from falling masonry, and bills and posters on the threatened walls announced that during the rebuilding, business would be carried on as usual at some other specified address. But Pilmansey's, so far, remained untouched, and the 2 searchers saw that customers were going in and out, all unaware that before evening their favourite resort for a light midday meal would attain a fame and notoriety not at all promised by its very ordinary and commonplace exterior.
An excellent example of the truth of the old saying that you should never judge by appearances, Andy, my man,
remarked Purdy, as they took a quick view of the place.
Who'd imagine that crime, dark secrets, and all the rest of it lies concealed behind this? Behind the promise of tea and muffins, milk and buns. It's a queer world, this London. You never know what lies behind any single bit of the whole microcosm. But let's see what's to be seen inside.
The first thing to be seen inside the ground-floor room into which they stepped was the man from New Scotland Yard, who, in company with another very ordinary-looking individual, was seated at a little table just inside the entrance, leisurely consuming coffee and beef sandwiches. He glanced at the 2 men as if he had never seen them in his life, and they, preserving equally stolid expressions with credit, if not with the detective's ready and trained ability, passed further on, only to recognize Levendale and Stephen Purvis, who had found accommodation in a quiet corner halfway down the room. They, too, showed no signs of recognition, and Purdy, passing them by, steered his companion to an unoccupied table and bade him be seated.
"Let's get our bearings,"
he whispered as they dropped into their seats.
"Looks as innocent and commonplace within as it appeared without, Andy. But use your eyes. It ought to make good copy for you, this."
Lauriston glanced about him. The room in which they sat was a long, low-ceilinged apartment, extending from the street door to a sort of bar counter at the rear, beyond which was a smaller room that was evidently given up to store and serving purposes. On the counter were set out provisions, rounds of beef, hams, tongues, bread, cakes, confectionery. Behind it stood two men whom the watchers at once set down as the proprietors. Young women, neatly gowned in black and wearing white caps and aprons, flitted to and fro between the counter and the customers. As for the customers, they were of both sexes, and the larger proportion of them young. There was apparently no objection to smoking at Pilmansey's. A huge cloud of blue smoke ascended from many cigarettes, and the scent of Turkish tobacco mingled with the fragrance of freshly ground coffee. It was plain that Pilmansey's was the sort of place wherein you could get a good sandwich, good tea or coffee, smoke a cigarette or two, and idle away an hour in light chatter with your friends between your morning and afternoon labours. But Lauriston's attention was mainly directed to the two men who stood behind the bar counter, superintending and directing their neat assistants. Sly, smooth, crafty men, so they had been described by Mr. Mori Yada. Lauriston's opinion coincided with that of the Japanese, on first, outer evidence and impression. They were middle-aged, plump men who might be, and probably were, twins, favouring mutton-chop whiskers and good linen and black neckcloths. They might have been strong, highly respectable butlers. Each had his coat off, each wore a spotless linen apron, each wielded carving knives and forks, each was busy in carving plates of ham or tongue or beef, each contrived, while thus engaged, to keep his sharp, beady eyes on the doings in the room in the front of the counter. Evidently a well-to-do, old-established business, this, and highly prosperous men who owned it. Lauriston wondered that they should run any risk by hiding away a secret opium den somewhere in their ancient premises. In the midst of their reflections one of the waitresses came to the table at which the two friends sat. Lauriston, quicker of wit than Purdy in such matters, immediately ordered coffee and sandwiches, and until they came, lighted a cigarette and pretended to be at ease, though he was inwardly highly excited.
"It's as if one were waiting for an explosion to take place,"
he muttered to Purdy.
"Even now I don't know what's going to happen."
"Here's Ayscough, anyway. He looks as if nothing was about to happen."
Ayscough, another man with him, was making his way unconcernedly down the shop. He passed the man from New Scotland Yard without so much as a wink. He ignored Levendale and Stephen Purvis. He stared blankly at Purdy and Lauriston, and led his companion to two vacant seats near the counter. And they had only just dropped into them when in came Mr. Killick with John Purvis and Guyler, and slipped quietly into seats in the middle of the room. Here, then, said Lauriston to himself, were 11 men, all in a secret, and there were doubtless others amongst the company whom he did not know.
"But where's Melky Rubinstein?"
he whispered suddenly.
"I should have thought he'd have turned up. He's been so keen on finding things out."
"There's time enough yet,"
answered Purdy.
"It's not one. I don't see the Jap either. But here's the inspector, done up in plain clothes."
The inspector came in with a man whom neither Purdy nor Lauriston had ever seen before, a quietly but well-dressed man about whom there was a distinct air of authority. They walked down the room to a table near the counter, ordered coffee and lighted cigarettes. And the two young Scotsmen, watching them closely, saw that they took a careful look round as if to ascertain the strength of their forces. And suddenly, as Lauriston was eating his second sandwich, the inspector rose, quietly walked to the counter, and bending over it, spoke to one of the white-aproned men behind.
"The game's begun,"
whispered Lauriston.
"Look."
But Purdy's eyes were already fixed on the Pilmanseys, whom he recognized as important actors in the drama about to be played. One of them, slightly taller, slightly greyer than the other, was leaning forward to the inspector, and was evidently amazed at what was being said to him, for he started, glanced questioningly at his visitor, exchanged a hurried word or two with him, and then turned to his brother. A second later both men laid down their great knives and forks, left their counter, and beckoned the inspector to follow them into a room at the rear of the shop. And the inspector, in his turn, beckoned Ayscough with a mere glance, and Ayscough, in his, made an inviting movement to the rest of the party.
"Come on,"
said Purdy.
"Let's hear what's happening."
The proprietors of the tea-rooms had led the inspector and the man who was with him into what was evidently a private room, and when Lauriston and Purdy reached the door they were standing on the hearthrug, side by side, each in a very evident state of amazement, staring at a document which the inspector was displaying to them. They looked up from it to glance with annoyance at the other man who came quietly and expectantly crowding into the room.
"More of your people?"
asked the elder man, querulously.
"Look here, you know. We don't see the need for all this fuss. Not for your interrupting our business in this way. One or two of you surely would have been enough. Without bringing a troop of people into our premises, all this is unnecessary."
You'll allow us to be the best judge of what is necessary and what isn't, Mr. Pilmansey,
retorted the inspector.
There'll be no fuss, no bother, needn't be, anyway. If you tell us what we want to know, and don't oppose us in what we have got power to do. Here's a warrant, granted on certain information, to search your premises. If you'll let us do that quietly.
"But for what reason?"
demanded the younger man.
"Our premises, indeed. Been established here a good 100 years, and never a word against us. What do you want to search for?"
I'll tell you that at once,
answered the inspector.
We want a young Chinaman, one Chang Li, who we are informed is concealed here, and has valuable stolen property on him. Now then, do you know anything about him? Is he here?
The two men exchanged glances. For a moment they remained silent. Then the elder man spoke, running his eye over the expectant faces watching him.
"Before I say any more,"
he answered,
"I should just like to know where you got your information from."
No,
replied the inspector, firmly.
I shan't tell you, but I'll tell you this much. This Chang Li is wanted on a serious charge, as it is. And we may charge him with something much more serious. We have positive information that he is here. And I'm only giving you sound advice when I say that if he is here, you will do well to show us where he is. Now come, Mr. Pilmansey. Is he here?
The elder Pilmansey shook his head, but the shake was more one of doubt than of denial.
"I can't say,"
he answered.
"He might be."
What's that mean?
demanded the inspector.
Might be? Surely you know who is in your own house?
"No,"
said the elder man.
"I can't say. It's this way. We've a certain number of foreigners come here. There are few, just a few Chinese and Japanese medical students, you know. Now, some time ago, a couple of years ago, some of them asked us if we couldn't let them have 3 or 4 rooms at the top of the house, in which to start a sort of little club of their own, so that they could have a place for their meetings, you understand. They were all quiet, very respectable young fellas, so we did. They have the top floor of this house. They furnished and fitted it up themselves. There's separate entrance at the side of the shop. Each of them has a latch key of his own, so they can go in and out as they like. They never bother us. But as a matter of fact, there are only 4 or 5 of them who are members now. The others have all left. That's the real truth. And I tell you, I don't know if Mr. Chang Li might be up there or not. We know nothing about what they do in their rooms. They're only our tenants."
Let me ask you one question,
said the inspector.
Have either of you ever been in those rooms since you let them to these people?
"No,"
answered the elder man.
"Neither of us, at any time."
Then,
commanded the inspector,
I'll thank you to come up with us to them. Now.
End of chapter 36. The Orange Yellow Diamond by J.S. Fletcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 37. Chang Li. Not without some grumbling as to waste of time and interference with business, the Pilmansey brothers led the way to a side door which opened into a passage that ran along the side of the shop and from whence a staircase rose to the upper regions of the house. The elder pointed significantly to the street door at the end.
You'll take notice that these young fellows I told you of get to the rooms we let them through that,
he observed.
That door's always locked. They all have latch keys to it. They never come through the shop. We've nothing to do with them, and we don't know anything about whatever they may do in their rooms. All we're concerned with is that they pay their rent and behave themselves. And quite enough, they've always been. We've had no reason to complain.
And, as they all have latchkeys, I suppose they can get into the place at any hour of the day or night,
suggested the inspector.
There is no bar against them coming here at night?
They can come in and go out whenever they please,
answered the elder man.
I tell you, we've nothing to do with them, except as their landlords.
Where do you live yourselves?
Asked the inspector.
On these premises?
No, we don't,
replied the younger brother, who, of the two, had showed the keenest, if most silent, resentment at the police proceedings.
We live elsewhere. This establishment is opened at 8 in the morning and closed at 7 in the evening. We are never here after 7, either of us.
So that you never see anything of these foreigners at night time?
Asked the inspector.
Don't know what they do, I suppose.
We never see anything of them at any time,
said the elder brother.
As you see, this passage and staircase is outside the shop. We know nothing whatever about them beyond what I've told you.
Well, take us up, and we'll see what we can find out,
commanded the inspector.
We're going to examine those rooms, Mr. Pilmansey, so we will have to get it done at once.
The intervening rooms between the lower and the top floors of the old house appeared to be given up to stores. The open doors revealed casks, cases, barrels, piles of biscuit and confectionery boxes. Nothing to conceal there, decided the lynx-eyed men who trooped up the dingy stairs after the grumbling proprietors. But the door on the top floor was closed, and when Ayscough turned its handle he found it to be locked from within.
They have keys of their own for that, too,
remarked the younger Pilmansey.
I don't see how you're going to get in if there's nobody inside.
We're going in there whether there is anybody or not,
said the inspector.
Knock, Ayscough. Knock loudly.
The group of men gathered behind the leaders, and filling the whole of the lobby outside the closed door, waited, expectant and excited, in the silence which followed on Ayscough's loud beating on the upper panel. A couple of minutes went by. The detective knocked again, more insistently, and suddenly and silently the door was opened, first an inch or two, then a little wider, and as Ayscough slipped a stoutly booted foot inside the crack a yellow face, lighted by a pair of narrow-slitted dark eyes, looked out and immediately vanished.
In with you,
said the inspector.
Careful now.
Ayscough pushed the door open and walked in, the rest crowding on his heels, and Purdy, who was one of the foremost to enter, was immediately cognizant of two distinct odours, one the scent of fragrant tea, the other of a certain heavy, narcotic something which presently overpowered the fragrance of the tea and left it acid and bitter taste.
Opium,
he whispered to Lauriston, who was close at his elbow.
Opium, smell it?
But Lauriston was more eyes than nose just then. He, like the rest of his companions, was staring at the scene on which they had entered. The room was of a good size, evidently, from its sloping ceilings, part of the attic story of the old house. The walls were hung with soft, clinging oriental draperies and curtains. A few easy chairs of wicker-work, a few small tables of like make, were disposed here and there. There was an abundance of rugs and cushions. In one corner a gas stove was alight, and on it stood a kettle, singing merrily. The young man who had opened the door had retreated towards this stove. Purdy noticed that in one hand he held a small teapot, and in the left-hand corner, bent over a little table and absorbed in their game, sat two other young men, correctly attired in English clothes, but obviously Chinese from their eyebrows to their toes, playing chess. The holder of the teapot cast a quick glance at the disturbance of this peaceful scene, and set down his teapot. The chess players looked up for 1 second, showed not the faintest sign of perturbation, and looked down again. Then the man of the teapot spoke. One word.
Yes?
He said.
The fact is, mister,
said the elder Pilmansey,
these are police officers. They want one of your friends, Mr. Chang Li.
The three occupants of the room appeared to pay no attention. The chess players went on playing. The The other man reached for a canister and mechanically emptied tea out of it into his pot.
"Shut and lock that door, Ayscough,"
said the inspector.
"Let somebody stand by it, now,"
he continued, turning to the 3 Chinese.
"Is one of you gentlemen Mr. Chang Li?"
"No,"
replied one of the chess players.
"Not one of us."
"Is he here?"
demanded the inspector. Then, seeing that he was to be met by Oriental impassivity, he turned to the Pilmanseys.
"What other rooms are there here?"
he asked.
2.
Answered the elder brother, pointing to the curtains at the rear of the room.
One there, the other there, behind those hangings. 2 smaller rooms.
The inspector strode forward and tore the curtains aside. He flung open the first of the doors and started back, catching his breath.
"Phew,"
he said. The heavy narcotic odor which Purdy had noticed at once on entering the rooms came afresh out of the newly opened door in a thick wave, and as the rest of them crowded after the inspector they saw why. This was a small room, hung like the first one with curiously figured curtains and lighted only by a skylight over which a square of blue stuff had been draped. In the subdued light they saw that there was nothing in that room but a lounge well fitted with soft cushions and pillows, and on it, his spare figure wrapped in a loose gown, lay a young Chinaman, who, as the foremost advanced upon him, blinked in their wondering faces out of eyes the pupils of which were still contracted. Near him lay an opium pipe, close by, on a tiny stand, the materials for more consumption of the drug. The man who had accompanied the inspector in his entrance to the tea shop strode forward and seized the recumbent figure by the shoulder, shaking him gently.
"Now then,"
he said sharply.
"Wake up, my man. Are you Chang Li?"
The glazed eyes lifted themselves a little wonderingly. The dry lips moved.
"Yes,"
he muttered.
"Chang Li, yes. You want me?"
"How long have you been here?"
demanded the questioner.
"How long? Yes. I don't know. What do you want?"
asked Chang Li.
"I don't know you."
The tea maker thrust his head inside the room.
"He can't tell you anything,"
he said with a grin.
"He has been what you call on the breakout, with opium, ever so many days. He has attacks that way, takes a fit of it, just as some of your people take to the drink. He's coming out of it now, and he'll be very, very unhappy tomorrow."
The inspector twisted round on the informant.
"Look here," he
said.
"Do you know how long he has been here, stupefying himself? Is it a day or days?"
One of the chess players lifted a stolid face.
"He has been here, like that, several days,"
he said.
"It's useless trying to do anything with him. When he takes the fit, the craving, you understand, into his head. If you want any information out of him, you'd better call again in a few hours."
"Do you mean to tell me he has been here like that several days?"
demanded the inspector. The young man with the teapot grinned again.
"He's never been at class at the medical school since the 17th,
he announced.
"I know that. He's in some classes with me. He's been here all the time since then."
The inspector turned sharply on Ayscough.
"The 17th?"
he exclaimed.
"And that affair was on 18th. Then—"
Chang Li was fumbling in a pocket of his gown. He found something there, raised a hand to his lips, swallowed something, and in a few seconds, as his eyes grew brighter, he turned a suspicious and sullen glance on the group which stood watching him.
"What do you want?"
he growled.
"Who are you?"
"We want some information from you,"
said the inspector.
"When did you last see your brother, or friend, or whatever he is, Chang Li?"
Chang Li shook his head. It was obvious that he had no clear recollection.
"Don't know,"
he answered.
"Perhaps just now. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps not for a long time."
"When were you last at home in Maida Vale?"
asked the inspector. But Chang Li gave no answer to that beyond a frown, and it was evident that as his wits cleared his temper was becoming ugly. He began to look round with more intelligence, scanning one face after another with growing dislike, and presently he muttered certain observations to himself which, though not in English, sounded anything but complimentary to those who watched him. And Ayscough suddenly turned to the superior officials.
"If this man's been here ever since the 17th,
he said,
he can't have had anything to do with the affairs in Proud Street, and might have well. Supposing now, I'm only supposing, that young Jap's been lying all that time."
He turned again, this time on the two chess players, who had now interrupted their game and were leaning back in their chairs, evidently amused at the baffled faces of the searchers.
"Here,"
he said.
"Do you know one Yada, Mori Yada, a Japanese? Is he one of you?"
Oh, yes,
answered one of the chess players.
Yada, yes. We know him. A very smart fellow, Yada. You know him, too?
But before Ayscough could reply to this somewhat vexatious question, a man who had been left in the tea-rooms came hurrying up the staircase and burst in upon them. He made straight for the inspector.
"Man from the office, sir. Outside, in a taxi,"
he exclaimed breathlessly.
"You're on the wrong track. You're to get to Maltenius's shop in Pratt Street at once. The real man's there."
End of chapter 37. The Orange Yellow Diamond by J.S. Fletcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 38. The Jew and the Jap. When Melky Rubenstein slipped quietly out of the police station, he crossed the street, and taking up a position just within a narrow alley on the other side, set himself to watch the door which he had just quitted. There was a deep design in his mind, and he meant to carry it out, alone. Mr. Mori Yada, apparently as cool and unconcerned as ever, presently tripped down the steps of the police station and went leisurely off, swinging his neatly rolled umbrella. As long as he was within sight of the police station windows, he kept up the same gentle pace. But as soon as he had turned the first corner his steps were quickened, and he made for a spot to which Melky had expected him to make, a cab rank, on which 2 or 3 taxicabs were drawn up. He had reached the first, and was addressing the driver, when Melky, who had kept a few yards in the rear, stole up gently to his side and tapped him on the shoulder.
"Mister,"
said Melky.
"A word, in private."
Yada turned on his interrupter with the swiftness of a snake, and for a second his white teeth showed themselves in an unmistakable snarl, and a savage gleam came into his dark eyes. Both snarl and gleam passed as quickly as they had come, and the next instant he was smiling as blandly as ever.
"Oh, yes,"
he said.
"It is you. How do you do? Perhaps you were going my way. Can I give you a lift?" "Yes."
Melky drew his man away a yard or two and lowered his voice to a whisper.
"Mister?"
he said, with a note of deep confidence which made Yada look at him with a sudden sense of fear.
"Mister, I wouldn't go no way at all if I was you, just now. You're in danger, mister. You shoved your head into the lion's den when you walked in where I've just seen you. Deep, deep is them fellows, mister. They're having you on toast. I know where you're thinking of going, mister, in that cab. Don't go. Take my tip."
"How do you know where I'm going?"
demanded Yada.
"I was looking over Levendale's shoulder when he wrote that bit of a check, mister,"
answered Melky in his quietest accents.
"You're off to his bank to turn it into cash, and if you walk into that bank, well, you'll never walk out again alone. Mister, they're going to collar you there. There's a trap laid for you."
Melky was watching Yada's face out of his own eye corners, and he saw the olive-tinted skin pale a little, and the crafty eyes contract, and on the instant he pursued his tactics and his advantage. He had purposely steered the Japanese into a more crowded part of the street, and he now edged him into a by-alley which led to a rookery of narrow by-streets beyond. He felt that Yada was yielding, oppressed by a fear of the unknown, but suddenly Yada paused, drawing back from the hand which Melky had kept on his arm.
"What are you after?"
he demanded.
"What is your game, eh? You think to alarm me. What do you want?"
"Nothing unreasonable, mister,"
answered Melky.
"You'll easily satisfy me. Game? Come now, mister, I know your game. Bank first, to get some ready, then somewhere to pick up a bit of luggage, then a railway station. That's it, ain't it now? No bloomin' good, mister. They're ready for you the minute you walk into that bank. If they don't take you then, they'll only wait to follow you to the station. Mister, you ain't a cat's chance. You're done, if you don't make it worth my while to help you. See?
Yada looked round, doubtfully. They had turned 2 or 3 corners by that time, and were in a main street, which lay at the back of Praed Street. He glanced at Melky's face, which suggested just then nothing but cunning and stratagem.
What can you do for me?
He asked.
How much do you want? You want money, eh?
Make it 100 quid, mister,
said Melky.
Just 100 of the best, and I'll put you where all the police in London won't find you for the rest of today, and get you out of it at night in such a fashion that you'll be as safe as if you was at home. You won't never see your home in Japan again, mister, if you don't depend on yours truly. And 100 ain't nothing, considering what you got at stake.
I haven't £100 to give you,
answered Yada.
I have scarcely any money but this cheque.
Of course you ain't, mister,
agreed Melky.
I twigged your game straight off. You only came there to the police station to put yourself in funds for your journey. But that's all right. You come along with me, and let me put you in safety, and then you can give me that cheque. I'll get it cashed in 10 minutes without going to any bank, see? Friend of mine thereabouts. He'll cash it at his bank close by. Anybody'll cash a cheque 11 Come on, now, mister. We're close to that little port of refuge I'm telling you about.
The bluff was going down. Melky felt, as much as saw, that Yada was swallowing it in buckets, and he slipped his hand within his companion's arm, piloted him along the street, across Praed Street, round the back of the houses, into the narrow passage which communicated with the rear of the late Daniel Maltenius's premises, and in at the little door which opened on the parlour wherein so many events had recently taken place.
Where are you taking me?
asked Yada, suspiciously, as they crossed the threshold.
All serene, mister,
answered Melky, reassuringly.
Friend of mine here, my cousin. All right, and all secure. You're as safe here as you will be in your grave, mister. So help me you are. Zillah?
Zillah walked into the parlour, and justified Melky's supreme confidence in her by showing no surprise or embarrassment. She gave Yada the merest glance, and turned to Melky.
Bit of business with this young gentleman, Zillah,
said Melky.
That little room upstairs now, what?
Oh, all right,
said Zillah, indifferently.
You know your way. You'll be quiet enough there.
Melky signed to Yada to follow him, and led the way up the stairs to the very top of the house. He conducted the Japanese into the small room in which were some ancient, moth and worm-eaten bits of furniture, an old chest or two, and a plenitude of dust, and carefully closed the door when he and his captive had got inside.
Now, mister,
he said,
you're as safe here as you could be in any spot in the wide world. Let's get to business, and let's understand each other. You want that cheque turned into cash? You want to get out of London tonight? All right, then hand over your cheque and keep quiet till I come back. Is there anything else now? Any bit of luggage you want?
You do all this if I pay you £100?
asked Yada.
That'll do me, mister,
answered Melky.
I'm a poor fellow, do you see? I don't pick up 100 quid every day, I assure you. So if there is anything...
A suitcase, at the luggage office at Oxford Circus Tube,
said Yada.
I must have it. Papers, you understand. If you will get me that.
Give me the ticket, and that cheque,
said Melky. He slipped the 2 bits of paper into his pocket and made for the door.
I'll turn the key outside,
he said.
You'll be safer. Make yourself comfortable, mister. I'll be back in an hour with the money and the goods.
2 minutes later Melky confronted Zillah in the parlour and grinned at her. Zillah regarded him suspiciously.
What's this, Melky?
she demanded.
What are you up to?
Zillah,
said Melky.
You'll be proud of your cousin, Melky Rubinstein, before ever it's dinner time. You will do, Zillah. And in the meantime, keep your counsel, Zillah, while he fetches a nice large policeman.
Is that Japanese locked in that little room?
asked Zillah. Melky tapped the side of his nose and without a word looked out into the street. A policeman, large enough for all practical purposes, was lounging along the sidewalk. Another, equally bulky, was looking into a shop window 20 yards away across the street. Within a couple of minutes Melky had both in the back parlour, and was giving them and Zillah a swift but particular account of his schemes.
You're sure you're right, Melky?
asked Zillah.
You're not making a mistake?
Mistake?
exclaimed Melky, satirically.
You'll see about that in a minute, now,
he added, turning to the policeman.
You come quietly up, and do exactly what I've told you. We'll soon know about mistakes, Zillah.
Yada, left to himself, had spent his time in gazing out of the dirty window of his prison. There was not much of a prospect. The window commanded the various backyards of that quarter. As if to consider any possible chance of escape, he looked out. There was a projection beneath him, a convenient water-pipe. He might make a perilous descent, if need arose, but, somehow, he believed in that little Jew. He believed, much more, in the little Jew's greed for £100 of ready money. The little Jew with the cunning smile had seen his chance of making a quiet penny, and had taken it. It was all right, said Yada, all right. And yet, there was one horrible thought. Supposing, now that Melky had got the cheque, that he cashed it and made off with all the money, never to return. On top of that thought, Melky did return, much sooner than Yada had expected. He opened the door and beckoned the prisoner out into the dark lobby at the top of the stairs.
Come here a minute, mister,
said Melky, invitingly.
Just a word.
Yada, all unsuspecting, stepped out and found his arms firmly gripped by two bulky policemen. The policemen were very quiet, but Melky laughed gleefully while Yada screamed and cursed him, and while he laughed Melky went through his prisoner's pockets in a knowing and skilful fashion, and when he had found what he expected to find, he made his helpers lock Yada up again, and taking them downstairs to the parlour, laid his discoveries on the table before them and Zillah. There was a great orange-yellow diamond in various folds of tissue paper, and a thick wad of bank-notes, with an india-rubber band round them. These valuables lay, carelessly displayed, on the table when the party from Pilmansey's tea-rooms came tumbling into the shop and the parlour, an hour later. Melky was calmly smoking a cigar, and he went on smoking it as he led the inspector and his men upstairs to the prisoner. He could not deprive himself of the pleasure of a dig at Ayscough.
Went one better than you again, Mr. Ayscough,
he said, as he laid his hand on the key of the locked room.
Now, if I hadn't seen through my young gentleman...
But there, as Melky threw open the door, his words of assurance came to an end. His face dropped as he stared into an empty room. Yada had risked his neck and gone down the water-pipe. End of chapter 38. The Orange-Yellow Diamond by J.S. Fletcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 39. The Diamond Necklace. For the better part of a fortnight, the sleuth hounds of New Scotland Yard hunted for Mr. Mori Yada in all the likely and unlikely places in London, and sent out their inquiries much further afield. They failed to find him. One small clue they got, with little difficulty. After the hue and cry was fairly out, an Edgware Road pawnbroker came forward and informed the police that at 2 o'clock or thereabouts, on the afternoon of the day on which Yada had made his escape from the window, a young Japanese gentleman, who gave his name as Mr. Motono and his address as a small hotel close by, and who volunteered the explanation that he was temporarily short of cash until a remittance arrived, had borrowed £5 from him on a pearl tie-pin which he had drawn from his cravat. That was Yada, without a doubt, but from that point Yada vanished. But hunger is the cleverest detective, and at the end of the fortnight certain officials of the Japanese embassy in London found themselves listening to a strange tale from the fugitive, who had come to the end of his loan, had nowhere to turn, and no one but the representatives of his nation to whom he could appeal. Yada told a strange tale, and all the stranger because, as the police officials who were called in to hear it anew recognized that there was probably some truth in it. It amounted, when all was heard, to this. Yada was willing to confess that for a few days he had been a successful thief, but he stoutly denied that he was a murderer. This was his story. On the 18th November, in the evening, he was at the club which housed itself in Pilmansey's attic. There he saw Chang Li, who, according to the other members who were there, was beginning one of his periodic fits of opium smoking, and had been in the inner room, stupefying himself, since the previous day. Yada knew that it was highly necessary that Chang Li should be in attendance at certain classes at the medical school during the next few days, and tried to rouse him out of his debauch, with no result. Next day, the 19th, he went to Pilmansey's again. Chang Li was still in the realms of bliss, and likely to stop there until he had had enough of them. For 2 days nobody at the club nor at the school had seen Chang Li, and Chang Li was the only person who could do anything with Chang. So, late that night of the 19th November, Yada went up to Maiden Vale, taking Chang Li's keys with him. He admitted himself to garden and house, and found the house empty. But just as he was entering the front door, he heard the voice of Chang Li at the garden gate. He also heard the voice of an Englishman. Also he caught something of what that Englishman said. He was telling Chang Li that he'd better take him, the Englishman, inside, and settle with him, or things would be all the worse. And at that, he, Yada, had slipped into the house, quietly closed the front door behind him, gone into the front room, hidden himself behind a curtain, and waited. Into that front room Chang Li had presently conducted a man. He was, said Yada, a low-class Englishman, what is called a Cockney. He had begun to threaten Chang Li at once. He told his tale. He was, said this fellow, next-door neighbour to Mr. Daniel Moltenius in Praed Street, Chang Li's landlord. His name, if Chang Li wanted to know it, was Parslett, fruiteer and greengrocer, and it was there, bold as brass, over his shop door, for him or anybody to look at. He had a side door to his house. That side door was exactly opposite a side door in Mr. Moltenius's house, opening into his back parlour. Now, the previous afternoon, he, Parslett, had had a consignment of very fine mushrooms sent in, rare things at that time of year, and knowing that the old man had a great taste for them and didn't mind what price he paid, he stepped across with a dish of them to tempt him. He found Mr. Moltenius in his parlour. He was counting a lot of banknotes. They must, said Parslett, have represented a large sum. The old man bade him leave the mushrooms, said he'd send him the money across presently, and motioned him out. Parslett put the dish of mushrooms aside on a chiffonier, and went away. Somewhat later, chancing to be at his front door, and looking out into the street, he saw Chang Li open the door of Moltenius's shop and go swiftly away. Half an hour after that he heard that something had happened at Moltenius's. Later in the evening he heard definitely that the old man had been assaulted under circumstances which pointed to murder for the sake of robbery, and then he, Parslett, now put 2 and 2 together, and had fixed on Chang Li as the culprit. And now, how much was Chang Li going to pay for his silence? According to Yada, Chang Li had had little to say. His chief anxiety, indeed, had been to find out what the man wanted. Parslett was definite enough about that. He wanted £1,000, and he wanted it in gold, and as much of it as Chang Li could hand out there and then. He refused to believe that Chang Li hadn't gold in considerable quantities somewhere about. He must, said Parslett, have changed some of those notes since he had stolen them the previous day. Chang Li protested that he had but some £50 or £60 in gold available, but he promised to have the rest of the 1,000 ready on the following evening. Finally, he handed Parslett £50, arranged that he should call the next night, and then invited him to take a drink. Parslett pocketed the money and accepted the invitation, and Yada, from his hiding-place, saw Chang Li go to the sideboard, mix whiskey and soda, and pour into the mixture a few drops from a phial which he took from his waistcoat pocket. Parslett drank off the contents of the glass, and Chang Li went down to the gate with him. Yada followed to the front door, and, through a slight opening, watched. The garden was fairly well lighted by the moon, which had recently risen. He saw Chang Li let the man out. He saw him turn from the gate and slowly come back towards the house. And then he saw something else. The sudden spring, from behind a big laurel bush, of a man, a short-statured, slight-figured man, who leapt on Chang Li with the agility of a panther. He saw the flash of a knife in the moonlight. He heard a muffled cry and startled groan, and saw Chang Li pitch forward and lie evidently lifeless where he fell. He saw the assailant stoop, seize his victim by the shoulders, and drag him behind the shrubbery. Then, without further delay, the murderer hurried to the gate, evidently assured himself that there was no one about, let himself out, and was gone. By all the solemn oaths that he could think of, Yada swore that this was true. Of another thing he was certain. The murderer was a Chinese. Now began his own career of crime. He was just then very hard up. He had spent much more than his allowance. He was in debt at his lodgings and elsewhere. Somewhere, he felt sure, there was, in that house, the money which Chang Li had evidently stolen from old Moltenius. He immediately set to work to find it. But he had no difficulty. The bank notes were in the drawer from which he had seen Chang Li take the gold which he had given to the blackmailer, Parslett. He hurriedly transferred them to his own pocket, and got away from the house by the door at the back of the garden, and it was not until late that night, in the privacy of his own rooms, that he found he had nearly £80,000 in his possession. For some days, said Yada, he was at a loss what to do with his booty. He was afraid of attempting to change £500 notes. He made cautious inquiries as to how that could be done, and he began to think that the notes were so much waste paper to him. And then Ayscough called on him, and for the first time he heard the story of the orange-yellow diamond. That gave him an idea. He had a very accurate knowledge of Chinese habits and characteristics, and he felt sure that Chang Li would have hidden that diamond in his pigtail. So he took advantage of his possession of the detective's card to go to the mortuary, to get a minute or two alone with the body, and to slip his hand underneath the dead man's silk cap. There he found the diamond, and he knew that whether the banknotes were to be of any value to him or not, the diamond would be if he could only escape to the continent. But he wanted funds. He wanted them badly. He thereupon conceived the bold idea of getting a reward for his knowledge. He went to the police station with a merely modest motive in his mind. £50 would carry him to Vienna, where he knew how to dispose of the diamond at once, with no questions asked. But when he found the owners of that diamond and the banknotes present, he decided to play for higher stakes. He got what he asked for, and, if it had not been for that little Jew, he said malevolently, he would have got out of England that eventful afternoon. But it was not so written, and the game was up. Only, what he had said was true. Now let them do what they could for him, but let them search for Chang Li's murderer. The folk who had been chiefly concerned about the orange-yellow diamond and the £80,000 worth of Bank of England notes were not so much troubled about proving the truth of Yada's strange story as Yada himself was. The main point to them was that they had recovered their property. Naturally, they felt remarkably grateful to Melky Rubenstein for his astuteness in circumventing Yada at what might have been the last moment. And one day, at that portion of it when business was slack and everybody was feeling comfortable after dinner, Melky called on Mrs. Goldmark and became confidentially closeted with her in a little parlour behind her establishment which she kept sacred to herself. Mrs. Goldmark, who had quick eyes, noticed that Melky was wearing his best clothes and a new silk hat, and new gloves, and had put his feet into patent leather boots which she secretly and sympathizingly felt to be at least a size too small for him. He sighed as he sat near her on the sofa, and Mrs. Goldmark looked at him with concern.
"Such a time you have lately, Mr. Rubenstein, don't you?"
she said feelingly.
"Such worries, such troubles. And the risk you ran taking that wicked young man all by yourself? So brave of you. You'd ought to have one of these medals what they give to folks, so?"
"You think that?"
responded Melky, brightening suspiciously.
"Oh, Mrs. Goldmark, your words is like wine. All my life I'd been wishing some beautiful woman would say them things to me. Now I feel like I was 2 feet taller, Mrs. Goldmark. But I don't want no medals, not me. Mr. Levendale and Mr. Purvis, they came to me and say they must give me a reward, handsome reward, you understand, for getting back their goods. So I say no, I won't have nothing for myself, nothing. But, I say, just so, there is one that should be rewarded. Mrs. Goldmark, do you know what? I think of you when I say that."
Mrs. Goldmark uttered a feeble scream, clasped her hands, and stared at Melky out of her melting eyes.
"Me?"
she exclaimed.
"Why, I ain't done nothing, Mr. Rubenstein."
"Listen to me,"
persisted Melky.
"What I says to Mr. Levendale is this here. If Mrs. Goldmark hadn't had her eating establishment, and if Mr. Purvis hadn't gone into it to eat a chop and to drop his platinum solitaire on the table, and if Mrs. Goldmark hadn't taken care of that platinum solitaire, and if things hadn't sprung from it, what then, I would like to know? So Mrs. Goldmark is entitled to whatever little present there is. That's how I put it, Mrs. Goldmark. And Mr. Levendale and Mr. Purvis, they agreed with me. And oh, Mrs. Goldmark, ain't you going to be nice and let me put this round your beautiful neck?"
Mrs. Goldmark screamed again as Melky produced a diamond necklace, lying in a blue velvet bed, in a fine morocco case. The glitter of the diamonds turned both beholders hoarse with emotion.
Do you know what, Mrs. Goldmark?
Whispered Melky.
It cost 1,000 guineas, and no error. Now you bend your lovely head, and I puts it on you. Oh, ain't you more beautiful than the Queen of Sheba? And ain't you Milky's queen, Mrs. Goldmark? Say you was.
Lor, Mr. Rubenstein,
said Mrs. Goldmark, coyly.
It's as if you was proposing to me.
Why, ain't I?
Exclaimed Melky, gathering courage.
Don't you see, I'm in all my best clothes? Ain't it nothing but weddings just now? There's Mr. Lauriston a-going to MaryZillah, and Mr. Purdy's a-fixing it up with Levendale's governess, and... Oh, Mrs. Goldmark, ain't I worshipped you every time I come to eat my dinner in your eating house? Ain't you the loveliest woman in all Paddington? Say the word, Mrs. Goldmark. Don't you see I'm like as if I was that hungry I could eat you?
Then Mrs. Goldmark said the word, and presently escaped from Melky's embrace to look at herself and her necklace in the mirror. The end. This is the end of chapter 39, and the end of The Orange Yellow Diamond by J.S. Fletcher. Thank you for listening.